So we are in a sermon series on story. 2 weeks ago we talked about Abraham, the story of Abraham. Story is such a great way for us to talk about things that are beyond us, things that are not easily articulated in formulas or graphs. Stories help us tell of things that are outside of our five senses, for example. In Abraham, we saw the story of a man who was able to engage a promise from God that went beyond his lifetime. And we saw how God makes promises to us that are beyond our life, across generations. Last week we talked about Moses. We talked about how Moses' faith, like many of our experiences, was not a straight line experience. We had lots of twists and turns, more like a watermelon vine. There's lots of fruit when you find it, but there's lots of twists to get to it. Today we're talking about Jesus. One of the blessings I have, one of the things that I get to do in my ministry is coach other ministers. I'm leaving tomorrow for a training event in Indianapolis for a week where I'll get some more training as a coach and be connected with ministers that I'll be able to work with in the next couple of years. Earlier this week I was having a discussion with a minister that I'm working with, and we got to talking about the creation story in Genesis and that phrase where God says, "Let us," plural, "make humanity in our," plural, "image." And how awkward that phrase is. Because we're monotheists, we think that God is singular, and yet God's self, is using this plural language. And one of the learnings that we gleaned from that, one of the joys, was the awkwardness of that phrase reminds us that God is so much larger than what we can comprehend. And even more, we are made in God's image. God is not made in our image. One of my favorite older hymns is "What a Friend We Have in Jesus." It's a great hymn, but it's a classic example of how often we talk about God in our image. We picture God as one of us with these human attributes, these human limitations. And we have the Footprints in the Sand poem, a great poem, but again, it's us thinking about Jesus as our friend who walks beside us. But in truth, Jesus is God, right? I mean, we have these formulas that we try to use to talk about Jesus. Jesus is fully human and fully divine, however that works. Jesus is as much God as God can be inside a person. And Jesus is everything that a person can be if they were everything they could be. But that means Jesus is not the friend we're used to having. Better, probably, to approach that through story. You remember the story of Lazarus? Lazarus was Jesus' friend, and he died. Jesus was off in the countryside doing ministry when Lazarus dies, and so word reaches Jesus, and Jesus just kind of lingers. Your friends, my friends, if one of us dies, our first response is usually go to them, go to their family, pick up the phone and call them. Not wait. And Jesus doesn't just wait a little bit. He doesn't like, "Oh, I'm going to finish folding the laundry and then go find how Lazarus is doing." He waits 4 days. He waits until Lazarus is buried and then shows up. So he shows up, and Lazarus' family, Mary and Martha, are the ones that sent the word, and they're not very happy with Jesus because Jesus didn't show up. Being present is a big deal in friendship. Being there for your friend is a big deal in friendship, and Jesus didn't show up. And more than that, Mary and Martha are convinced that Jesus has the power. If Jesus had shown up, Jesus would have fixed this. Jesus would have cured Lazarus. Jesus would never have died. So now Jesus has not only been absent, he has denied his friends the cure that they expected from Jesus. This isn't the friend we think about when we think about who's friend in our life. Conversely, Jesus calls out and says, "Open the tomb." Well, now we have a whole other experience. This is not what a friend does. A friend doesn't do something so appalling as ask you to bring back someone that's dead. They actually say to Jesus, "Whoa, he's going to smell. We are not doing this, Jesus. You are not being the friend we think you should be." But But they roll away the stone, they open the tomb, and Jesus yells out Lazarus' name, and Lazarus walks out of the tomb. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. Now that's a different kind of friend. That's a friend who maybe didn't react as we wanted. Jesus didn't fit our perception of what a friend is. But what Jesus did was so much more than what we think a friend can do. I would never dream of asking one of my friends to bring back a family member from the dead. And yet that's what Jesus does. As we think about writing our story and where our story intersects with Jesus, this pushes us from writing sweet notes about a sweet baby Jesus that walks through life with us, and now we have a different kind of person with us. This is someone with power that we can't understand. This is someone who could be a bit fearsome. I would be. If you look at this picture, this is Rembrandt's painting of the Lazarus story. I'd be terrified, probably. I would probably see Jesus in a completely different light after this. I might not stand always so close to him, but I'd never let him out of my sight because I'm going to want him at some point. But at the same time, I'm going to be intimidated by that power. This is a different kind of Jesus. So who is Jesus? If he's not the sweet baby Jesus friend that I thought when I started reading about Jesus, and if I'm trying to figure out in my head how Jesus can be God and human, maybe we look at love as a word that tries to capture who Jesus is. Nooni read for us today where I think some of this begins. Jesus is baptized, and in the Gospels, several of them tell the story. They all share in common God speaking out and claiming Jesus as God's Son. This is my Son with whom I am well pleased. Jesus does very little in his baptism. He shows up. He allows himself to be baptized. He allows himself to be claimed by God. And to me, it's an example of Jesus allowing himself to be loved. Like another story that we have of the woman who anoints Jesus' feet with some very expensive perfume and then uses her hair to dry his feet. And Jesus allows her to do this. When we're writing our story day in and day out, how many of our stories include that kind of vulnerability to someone else's love in our life? How often do we allow others to love us that deeply? Or how often do our stories include our defense mechanisms, protecting our personal space, keeping people at bay, because that kind of love is awkward, embarrassing, out of our control? We also have stories of Jesus not only being loved and allowing it to happen, we have Jesus loving other people. This is a picture of the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman at the well. So in his time and culture, taboo for him to be talking to a woman, taboo for him to be talking to a Samaritan. The Samaritan people, the Jewish people, very much at odds, very much in conflict. Beyond that, she's out there, we think, in the middle of the day. Most people would have done this water-carrying work at morning or night when it was cool. She has to go at one of the least favorite times of the day to go get water, probably because she's an outcast. She's one of the least of the communities, so she has to go at the least optimal time to get the water. And Jesus crosses all of these boundaries to draw her in. And it's not just the kind of social worker, school counselor, Friend of the Year award kind of crossing boundaries to draw her in and make her feel loved. There's something so unique about his presence, his impact on her. Not only does he cross the bounds to heal her, but he inspires her to such a degree that she goes to the community that sees her as the least of these and calls them to come and meet Jesus. That's unique. I don't know of anyone with that kind of power. I don't know of anyone who would step in my midst for the first time and I would be so convinced that I would go tell people that don't like me that they should come see Jesus. What find Jesus, right? But to do so in an authentic way, where now I want to be in community with them and Jesus through all of our brokenness, that's amazing. That's an amazing impact. This is a different kind of friend in our life. So Jesus is a model for us of allowing others to love us, loving other people across amazing bounds. But Jesus is also an example of trust and sacrifice. I love that phrase, God so loved the world that God sent his only Son. But it probably should be paired with, and God's Son so loved the world that God's Son allowed us to do this. And so we have this story. The story of Jesus loving us so much that when the passion happens, when he's arrested and when he's beaten and when he's oppressed, he does not speak up. This is the man who raised Lazarus from the dead. And when he's being physically abused, he just takes it. Not because you and I should take it when we're physically abused, but because he's unique. There's something different about this guy who is God. There's something profoundly different happening in this experience. I have this hanging in my office because it reminds me of how unique Jesus is in my life. And then we see Jesus on the cross. The figures down below, you see his mother Mary and the light being held by Jesus' beloved disciple John as he connects those two together because he's going to be leaving and he wants them to look after each other. Kneeling on the ground, we have the woman who anointed his feet with the jar of perfume. And then to Jesus' left, we have John the Baptist. So not historically accurate, obviously. John's dead by this point, but he's included because of his witness. And in Latin, which you can't read, not because you can't read Latin, it's just so small in print. I know you all read Latin, right? So, all right, next Sunday sermon is going to be in Latin. It says, he must increase and I must decrease. Talking about Jesus filling up who we are. We ourselves emptying ourselves so that Jesus can fill us up. And then the Lamb symbolizing Jesus as the Lamb of God. Then we have, as the story goes on, Jesus dies on the cross. And then Jesus is buried. The witnesses that are there, both followers and oppressors alike, who testify to how amazing this man is, how unique he is, how profoundly other Jesus is. And we have those great Easter stories of those that went to the tomb and found it empty. And then those that met Jesus along the way after he rose again. Stories like this one, the Supper at Emmaus. Two of Jesus' followers who are unnamed are walking back to their home in Emmaus. Jesus travels with them. They don't recognize him, maybe because of their grief, maybe because the risen Jesus is transfigured in some way, looks different. Most of my friends, if I didn't recognize them and we walked that far, like a good journey, and I never recognized who they were, probably a little put off. They didn't recognize me, I'd be a little put off. Jesus never misses a beat. He has compassion on them. He asks about why they're grieving. And then he starts to teach them about the scriptures that they know. They get into their home and they invite Jesus in. Jesus, even though they don't know who he is, instead of being put off and stomping on, takes their hospitality. Another example of Jesus allowing others to love him. And as they sit down to eat, he breaks the bread. And suddenly, aha, this is who this is. I love how Caravaggio captures their surprise. The one jumping from his chair and the other throwing his arms out. Oh my gosh, we just spent how long and didn't even know it was Jesus. Utterly amazing. As we write our future stories, the page is tomorrow. How many of those pages will include us allowing others to love us the way Jesus allowed others to love him? And if you can write a page like that, imagine the words that will flow off your pen. Words of thanksgiving and gratitude, being overwhelmed by someone loving you that way. Or what about writing pages where you're called to love someone else? Yesterday I was driving back from a cross-country meet and saw a sign that said, "Service reveals greatness." When we serve others out of love, it reveals the greatness that God's put inside of us. That story at the Last Supper, Dolly's representation here, where Jesus washes all their feet. Can you imagine that? And if you're writing a page in your story that has that kind of experience of Jesus love in your life, or you loving someone else that way, that intimately, that lovingly, imagine the words that flow off your pen. Or the illustrations that you add. It is profound the way in which Jesus, like no one else, can alter the pages of our book. Whether it's by inspiring us to be loved or to love someone else, or if it's as miraculous as raising someone from the dead. Either literally from the bodily dead, or from a relationship that was dead to us that is now reconciled. So many ways in which Jesus does this in our lives. Because no one else but Jesus can. Because somehow Jesus is God, human. Regardless, the best that we know God is Jesus.